Ladies and gentlemen, may I please welcome our next speaker, Ms. Neomai Maravuakula. Ms. Maravuakula is the team leader for governance and institutional strengthening for the Human Rights and Social Development Division at the Pacific Community, SPC. Today, she will speak on the regional overview of legislation relating to family protection orders. Ms. Maravuakula, I now invite you to please make your presentation. You have 15 minutes, ma'am, Inaka.
Thank you, William. Can I just check, is my PowerPoint being shared? Bulavinaka participants, fellow colleagues in the Pacific community, colleagues at ANU, thank you again for the opportunity to share a few remarks this morning. I've been asked to provide an overview of the family protection legislation in our region. I note that the various presentations that we will have today will share specific country experiences. So my presentation or my session this morning will provide some broad strokes on where we've come from, why a particular focus on domestic violence legislation, where we are now, some of the challenges that I note that your various presentations will also reinforce in terms of country commitments. In terms of violence against women in our region, many of you that practice in this area or do work in this area know the realities that we face. Tanuja, if you can go to the next slide. The statistics that we have in our region, this is just a snapshot of what we find in the quadrennial report and what we see in the various sub-regions. High rates of violence. We know we have this challenge, or we have this grave issue of high rates of violence against women and girls in our region. And in terms of the response that our governments have carried out in terms of addressing this issue, there have been a number of different responses, and one of them is in the development of this specific legislation. As you will all know, in the past, we had specific criminal or a specific crime or penal legislation that addressed some of this, but noting that this issue still was increasing in our various countries, in our various sub-regions, there was a need to look at having specific legislation to address this issue. Next slide, please. So if we look at looking at what we currently have in our region, or as we were moving towards the development of domestic violence legislation, some of what you see on the slide today, this and many others were factors that encourage our states, but also the various organizations that work towards ending violence against women to look at developing domestic violence legislation. You will all know that our region, about 10 years ago, we had a number of family health and safety studies that were carried out in the respective countries. These started to show the high rates of violence that we all knew was happening in our countries. We are fortunate in our region to have quite an active women's movement, whether they are established organizations or networks in these various countries. These organizations have been doing a lot of work around women's human rights, but also a specific focus on ending violence against women. The work that they have done in collaboration with government has really taken the momentum that was needed towards advocacy for this legislation, but also then through the passage and now implementation of these laws. Many of our ministries of women in the early days were then having a specific focus on not only developing gender policies, but were also developing ending violence against women policies. They were mapping out strategies, they were looking at ways in which their ministries, but also across government, they could be addressing this issue of violence against women and girls. our countries, as we all know, our leaders make many regional commitments to end gender inequality. William and our chair have talked about the recent triennial Pacific Women's Conference, the ministerial meeting. This again focused on what our ministers for women have mapped out in the next 3 years. We know that through our leaders, we have the Pacific Leaders Gender Declaration, all of these great commitments, but a need to put action into the many words or the many commitments that our leaders have made. Our various countries are also parties to various international human rights treaties, which again come back with key recommendations, looking at how our states can address the high rates of violence that were being experienced by not only women and girls, but other vulnerable members of our families and communities. And so, you know, as I said, through all of these various factors, some of them are what I've shared on this slide, and there were many others. There was a momentum by governments to look at developing or drafting their standalone domestic violence or family protection legislation. Next slide. In many of our countries, we have officers that they take the lead in drafting their the legislation for their respective countries. One of the things that we recognized in the early days as we were supporting our member countries, these domestic violence legislation was a different kind of law, was bringing, I think was bringing an issue that you know, many times are viewed as a private matter, and you are now seeing legislation that were developed to address what was viewed as a private matter. And sometimes, as we were working with our colleagues in countries, there was a challenge on, well, how do we do this? How do we take what families struggle with in their homes and put them in a law, and have a court now deciding, or have courts intervening in what was considered private. And we know that there are best practices developed around drafting of legislation on domestic violence laws. And we were quite grateful that many of our countries were keen to look at this best practice, to understand, if we develop domestic violence laws, what do we have to have in place? Understand that, but then also combine that in terms of the contextual setting of our countries. As you all know, you know, we can look to various countries internationally or regionally in terms of developing a legislation, but we have to ensure that it will then fit the context of the country that it's being applied in. So what you see on the screen is we worked with some of the countries in our region to develop what we call drafting options as they were developing their domestic violence legislation. It enabled these officers to unpack what these laws would have, what these laws would contain, but also unpack some of the reasoning around these provisions. Next slide, please. This is a slide that I like to share whenever I do any presentation on where our region is at in terms of domestic violence legislation. If you see on the screen, and as our chair for the regional working group has shared, in 2018, when we convened that regional consultation, that was 10 years since the first country, Vanuatu, had passed its domestic violence legislation. And I like to share this because it's a snapshot to show where we are, but where we've come from. And coming into this work, you know, one of the things I've always heard, you know, starting my work in the women's movement here in Fiji, but then progressing to do work in the region, working in this area on ending violence against women is one of the hardest things to do. It's hard to have conversations. It's hard to convince our leaders for the change to happen. But as my colleagues and I put this diagram together a couple of years ago, I just said to them, but look at what has happened. Since 2008, we have 14 pieces of legislation. The progress that have been made by our various governments to have this specific legislation that addresses domestic violence. So in 2008, we had the Vanuatu Family Protection Act that was passed. And in 2017, we had the most recent pieces of legislation, and that was from the Cook Islands and Pohnpei State in the Federated States of Micronesia. Next slide, please. So we had those 14 pieces of laws, and a lot of this were being developed as we, as countries were looking at, well, what could these laws cover? What are other countries, what have other countries done? What has worked for them? And then learning from that as they develop their own specific legislation. Next slide, please. So the next section is just looking at, well, you know, we've got these laws, that's great. What do they contain? And a lot of this is what you will hear. Well, today we'll be hearing mostly around the protection orders. But ideally what these laws have brought into place, and if you know, these may be familiar for you because you may see this in your own respective legislation. By having the domestic violence or the family protection law, there was specific definition of what domestic violence is. The physical, the psychological aspect. You know, a lot of times when in the past, before we had the legislation, it focused on the physical aspect of domestic violence. But here there was the opportunity to unpack and define the various ways that domestic violence is seen or is perpetrated. Not just physically, psychologically, we also have in legislation that refers to economic abuse. And economic abuse and psychological abuse were two of the areas that, you know, when we were supporting countries, two areas that were, I guess, new for them, and trying to understand what does it look like, what does it look like in our role, whether you are a police officer, whether you are in the courts, how do I identify and how do I include this in the expectation of my work. Another key aspect of this legislation is the definition of domestic relationship. Who or what does this law cover? And sometimes we're supporting countries to do this awareness. And we get questions on, well, does it cover this or does it cover this? But your laws will clearly define what domestic relationship is in that setting. Anything outside that goes to the other legislation. It also brought in specific domestic violence offenses, breach of domestic of protection orders. They were then those specific offenses. We'll hear a lot today on the protection orders. And as you know, in terms of the violence that a person or families face, there is the need for that immediate protection. And these laws brought in these protection mechanisms that assisted families to get that immediate relief or that immediate support. And I think one of the other key interesting aspect of these laws was finding ways to make these orders accessible. You know, being able to access it during court hours and after hours, because we know that a lot of times the violence happens at night, in the weekend, when the courts are not open. And it may happen in communities where the police are far away. You may not have the financial means to go to your nearest police station. So the law, in terms of protection mechanism, was trying to explore ways to make things easier and accessible for a survivor, even down to the forms that had to be filled, trying to look at ways that this was simplified for a survivor to be able to access. There are specific duties on lawyers, on judges, on health professionals. Again, in our work to support the various stakeholders in their roles, those that are set out in law. You know, as I said, this is dealing with a matter that affects a family or affects a community. And sometimes as individuals that have roles, there is the added, I guess, like to say, a temptation of you have your role of A, B, and C, but you would also then like to assist the family in another way, but it isn't your role. And so part of that support to countries as well is to make sure that those who have specific roles under the law understand the parameters that is expected of them. But also then, you know, we cannot do this work in isolation. That, you know, whether a survivor appears at the court, appears at the hospital, if their children start to show signs of what's happening at home, how do we ensure that that connection or that referral pathway is there? And I think lastly, to touch on, I've highlighted the various features of the domestic violence legislation, but if I could just touch on one more interesting aspect of some of our legislation is the special fund. Some of our countries have specific funds that have been set up to support survivors. Again, as I highlighted above, that's one of the key challenges for survivors sometimes, is that for a woman, they may be dependent on the same person that's perpetrating the violence as for the economic support. And some of these legislation provide for funds that may assist a survivor or may assist an organization that works closely with a survivor. Next slide, please. So, as I said, it's great momentum that our countries have undertaken since 2008. Those features that I've highlighted above, again, come from good intention, come from a good place of supporting a survivor. But one of the things, and this is a question I ask my team, but I also ask the ministries that I work with, is it just words? It's great words to have in a law and to have on paper, but at the end of the day, we want these words to matter for a survivor. And I think a lot of what you will be sharing today is sharing those experiences of where it has worked and where it may not have worked, and how we could maybe improve on some of these areas, particularly around that immediate protection that survivors are looking for. Next slide, please. So if I could just highlight a couple of challenges, which I'm sure that many of you will share through your presentation. I've talked about the law, the landscape, and what has brought us to this place, and the features that are there. And I've talked about, are these just great words, or do they make a difference in the life of survivors? And we will only know this as our countries work towards implementation. And that, in the work that you do around supporting survivors to access the protection order, the challenge is around resources. Many times it's not just the fees that they have to pay to apply. It may be the fare to get to your office, or the fare to get to the courts or to the police station. So there are various kinds of programs that are happening in our region, from the Family Protection Legal Aid Center in Tonga that provides free service support to survivors of domestic violence, to the work that our colleagues in the Solomon Islands are doing through the access to justice work that the Ministry of Women and the Ministry of Justice are doing. As I said, these are great words that we have in our legislation. But really, the test becomes how we implement and apply this. And I know through the work that our colleagues in the Solomon Islands are doing, through taking this out to the province, these legislation are for everybody. But how applicable are they for a woman who is out there in the province, for a woman who, whether in the main center or in the outer islands, can they access the protection that these laws set out? If they cannot, what do we need to be putting in place? And when I say we, government is the key stakeholder, but as partners that also support survivors. Next slide, please. All of us that are on this call today, but all of us that are on the ground in the countries, I like to share this, and this is what the Kiribati put together to highlight what the implementation looks like. And it basically means, or it basically shows a whole of community or a whole of society support and collaboration to ensure that those in the middle, our families, those that experience the violence, can experience or can access the protection that are in those legislation, that governments cannot do it alone, that the courts cannot do it alone. We need the schools, we need our churches, we need people in the community, because we're not just applying the law, but we're having to work with communities to understand that the violence that they may be experiencing or that they are perpetrating is wrong. And that if you are a perpetrator and you are perpetrating violence on your family, then you will have to be dealt with by the law. If you are family members that are experiencing this, you should be able to access help. And this is where you can access help. And because you access help, your family shouldn't be stigmatized for that. And I always like to share this image because it portrays what is needed. While we have legislation that have been developed by government, has to be resourced and implemented by government. Government needs everybody, and basically all of the various players or people that are connected to this call or people that are interested in this area. If we don't work with our governments, that law will not work. That those provisions on protection orders will not come to life. And finally, just my last slide, our chair talked about this regional working group. And many times we hear from our partners that we work with on the ground that, well, this isn't happening, you know, it's great to pass this law, but nothing is happening afterwards. You know, our chair for the regional working group talked about this group that has come together in 2018. I shared yesterday at the launch event for the outcomes document. When we started this journey in developing domestic violence legislation, we looked a lot outside internationally for best practice and for advice for our countries. You know, and one thing that, again, I've shared with a lot of our countries and with my colleagues, in this over 10 years that we've been down this journey of having this legislation, there must have been something that we've done right. There must have been challenges that we have faced that we can learn from. And that's what these government ministries are trying to do. They have passed this legislation. Again, you know, sometimes they face the challenge of being the ministry that are appointed to say, it's your law. You figure out how you're going to implement it. But as I showed you in the slide before, unless the other government ministries and other civil society agencies come together, that law will not come to life. And so this is one of the key things that the regional working group is trying to do, is to ensure that implementation is improved, implementation for provisions that haven't been activated is done so, for the bigger goal of ensuring that survivors can access justice. Thank you so much, William. I'm going to stop there. Again, thank you everybody for the time this morning, and I hope that you enjoy all of the sessions that you'll have today. Naka.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ms. Maravuakula, for that wonderful presentation. Thank you also for providing that overview of the regional progress with the respective legislation and the key achievements and challenges with the implementation of the law. And there are, as you mentioned, there's very important insights that will greatly assist all of us present here today in discussions and also in the finalization of our report. And once again, we thank you, Ms. Maravuakula, for that presentation.